welcome everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. My name is Barrett Johannesson, and I'm a member of the Zerion software team. Today we have John presenting on the essentials for project managers. First and foremost, we do have Zerion Academy. Now Zerion Academy came about in 2016, and we've just continued to build upon it in 2017. And now we're finally letting people in through the doors, more and more as each day goes on. That being said, with you attending today's webinar, you are going to have access to Zerion Academy, and the course will be uploaded there. Zerion Academy is a great resource for all your Zerion training content, and so you'll be able to go in there and access it at any time. And we never remove your license, as well as the fact we never remove the criteria or the content. So it's basically your one-stop shop for all your training material. Next, we do have a iFormBuilder certification session coming up in April, and the iFormBuilder certification is ideal for anyone who's looking to expand on their form building capabilities, as well as anyone who's interested in becoming a reseller. And you actually are required to become iFormBuilder certified if you are a reseller. It's a great way to enhance your form building skills, as well as learn more advanced functions. Next, we have 3 webinars coming up in March. The first is the second, and it's on Zerion Identity Management. So this is for all those customers who are looking to use Zerion web services as a solution. And so Zerion Identity Management, ZIM, is a huge part of that, and it's just a way to granularly manage all your users within your Zerion account. So any current or potential Zerion users, I highly suggest joining that session. Additionally, on the 16th, we want our customers to be spotlight. We want our customers to be the spotlight and showing off the different solutions that they've built. So if you're someone who's interested in presenting during that webinar, please let us know. We'll also be sending out an email finding some interest, or trying to find some interest from our customers as well. And then on the 29th of April, we do have our Getting Started with Data Integrations webinar for anyone who's looking to really enhance their projects and integrate their data with other systems. Now, before I hand over the presentation to John, I do have some quick questions we want to ask to kind of field our audience today. So the first poll I'm launching is just asking if you're a current user. So if everyone could take a second and respond to that, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, so most of you have already responded. Perfect. That's what we like to see. Very timely. And so I'll go ahead and I'll close this poll, and I'll launch another quick one. This one is about your management responsibilities. So for this, this is a multi-select, so choose as many of these responses that affect you. And while people are responding, John, I will let you know that we had 100% of our participants today are current users. So you are on point with that. And we'll just give it another second in hopes that we have some more people respond. And perfect, we have 100%. John, to help you out, I'll actually share the results so that you can see what people are responsible for, and everyone else on this call can see where what they do and what other people on this call do as well. And John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Barrett, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, looking at the poll, it looks like a lot of our attendees have to wear multiple hats when they are working on their data collection projects. It looks like a lot of people are building forms, but also focusing on the analysis of data as well as the management of those users and forms. So what I wanted to go over today were some essentials for people who are managing these data collection projects, and I've broken them down into 4 different categories or topics. So we're going to be covering different ways you're going to be managing devices. And so when I say devices, what I'm talking about is the actual mobile device that you're using to collect your data on. I want to talk about some of the different settings that there are available for that, and the decisions that you'll be making in terms of what will best fit your workflow. The second thing we'll talk about is the management of data. So we're going to be looking at different ways you can view your data and you can manipulate it and export it as well. Our third topic is going to be focused on managing users and forms. And given the results of the poll, it looks like this is going to be a very timely topic for us to talk about. I want to talk about different ways we can set up the management of users and forms to make sure that whatever solution you have is going to scale well as your projects continue to grow. And then finally, we'll talk briefly about managing your workflow. And so I want to introduce some topics in terms of ways to accelerate your workflow and to hopefully allow your organization to work faster and smarter. So let's start off by talking about managing devices. Specifically, I want to talk about understanding the trade-offs of different device configurations. Now, for any of you who have had to go into a device and change the server name, you know that there is a section under those settings called Synchronization Settings. We've gone over how to change the server name before, whether it's through a pre-migration call, a kickstart, or an article on the Customer Success Center. But there are also 4 other settings underneath that server name that impact the way the device functions in relation to the cloud server. And these are the 4 of them: sync on start, auto sync, delete on upload, and lastly but not least, download records. Now, each one of these settings is a toggle, meaning it can be disabled or enabled. And I'm going to talk about how the device will function given each one of these settings. So to start off with sync on start, if this setting is enabled, what that means is as soon as the device is as soon as the app is open on the device, it will try to sync with the web server immediately. Now, that can be great for doing things like downloading the latest versions of your forms or grabbing any records that may have been assigned to you. However, this does come with a caveat that if you are not connected, you're obviously not going to be able to sync at that point. In that event, it will give you a message saying that you were unable to sync, and then you'll be able to continue on with what was already currently on the device. For the next setting, the auto sync setting, if this is enabled, whenever a form is marked as being completed, then that record is going to try to sync automatically. Now, a form is going to be marked completed when all the fields that have been marked as required are filled in and the data collector presses done. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the form has been correctly completed. It just means that it has passed any sort of validation that's available and all the required fields have been filled in. If this is disabled, then the data collector would have to manually sync their device in order to upload those records. The third setting, delete on upload, is going to remove the local copy of that record when the record is uploaded. This is assuming that it is enabled. Having this enabled is going to make sure that your device stays nice and lean. You're not going to have a whole lot of records stored on it locally, so you don't have to worry about those building up. However, if you want to be able to go back and take a look at those records after the fact, then you would need to have this disabled. And finally, the last setting is going to be download records. If this is enabled, then that device will allow the user to download records that have been assigned to that user specifically. So if this is disabled, then even if a user has a record assigned to them, that device will be unable to download it. Now, what I've done for you next is come up with a couple of different scenarios that we've seen from organizations, from customers, and given you the settings that they use. So to start off with, if you're in an environment where you have zero connectivity, meaning your data collectors are not going to be connected to either Wi-Fi or cell signal, then the recommended setting that we see is to have the sync on start as well as auto sync disabled, leaving delete on upload as well as download records enabled. This is because if you're not going to be in an area with connectivity, it doesn't make sense for you to try to automatically sync your device, whether that be at the start, opening the app, or after a record has been completed. This is going to allow you to work a little bit faster. You're not going to have to go through as many error messages as you may have if those were enabled. The next scenario is similar, but this is going to be under the context of starting the day in the office. And the assumption with this is that you're starting off in an area where you will have connection every day. If this is the case, a lot of times what we see is sync on start is enabled while auto sync is disabled. The idea being here that the workflow would include the data collector syncing their device or opening the app before they leave the office and before they go into an area that may or may not be without connectivity. but this will allow them to download the most recent versions of the forms and any changes that have been made to forms or records that they may need for their data collection. You'll notice that delete and upload is still enabled, as well as download records. The final scenario I have is this keep for reference scenario. And given this scenario, what we have is a sync on start is going to be enabled, autosync will be disabled, and then we've disabled delete on upload, meaning that after I have a record that I filled out and I sync my device, that record will still persist on my mobile device so that I can keep it for reference if I need to look it up again later on. Now keep in mind that this will cause a slow and gradual buildup of storage that's used by the app, and so you want to be careful not to exceed any limitations you may have on the device. But this is going to enable the ability to refer back to records locally without having them be assigned to you. Now you'll notice that all three of these scenarios have autosync turned off or disabled, and this is something I like to talk about, especially when I do trainings with newer users. But I almost always have autosync turned off unless I see a compelling reason to enable it, and it's for a very specific reason, and I alluded to it earlier. But even if a record is marked as being done or being completed, that does not necessarily mean that the record was correctly completed. If you have a data collector who accidentally presses done, thus completing a record, assuming that all the required fields have been filled in, but they may not have filled in other fields yet, then it's going to automatically try to sync that record at that point, and we don't want that to happen. The end result ends up being that an administrator would then need to reassign that record back to that data collector for them to complete filling it out, or they would need to make the adjustments manually on the web portal, and both those things are going to take up your time that doesn't need to be done. So keeping this disabled will allow the data collector to go back in and edit the record, even if they've marked it as being completed, before syncing and pushing it up to the cloud. And so I always like to point that out. Now, some other settings on the device that I wanted to acknowledge are the device permissions. And so these are going to be permissions on the device that iForm will ask you to allow to use. And these are things such as the camera, or using the GPS coordinates, or the microphone for the elements that correspond to these different features. An important aspect about these permissions is that the app is only going to ask you for permissions that the forms on it require. Meaning, if none of your forms require you to take an image or to use the camera, then the device is not going to ask you for that permission. It will only ask you for permissions that it requires you to use. And this can be useful, especially when comparing screenshots to the Customer Success Center articles, where something may not look exactly the same, or if you're comparing it to another user who has a different set of forms assigned, that can explain the differences in appearance sometimes. Some other settings I wanted to highlight are the image size specifically. So what you're able to do is when you set up your forms and you set up the devices, you can designate the size of the image that will be captured, whether it be through an image element or for the drawing element. There are 4 settings for the image size, each one of them increasing in size, starting from small, medium, large, and then I believe the last one is called a full size. The app is defaulted to medium, and what I found is that for the majority of use cases, that works just fine. If you're running into scenarios, though, where your sync times may be becoming too large, then you may want to consider lowering the image size. Now, with that is going to come a decrease in quality as well, but you'll have to manage and weigh the pros and cons to that decision. Conversely, on the other side, if you need an image that is of higher quality, then you can consider increasing the image size, and then thus the image quality will improve as well. Now, something to understand is as the image size increases, if you are using the drawing element to annotate over the image, understand that each one of those layers is effectively an image itself. And so what will happen is you can run into a scenario where that element specifically can drastically impact your sync times. It can drastically increase them, or if you lower the image size, it could drastically decrease them as well. The last 2 settings I have here are the ability to change the font size as well as the label size as well as the label's font. So if you want to make changes to these so that the data collector using the device has an easier time reading it, that's possible. And the final setting here is the enablement of push notifications. And a push notification is going to be a simple message that company admins are able to send out to all users within a profile to their device. And so if this is enabled on the device, then that device will be capable of accepting those notifications. The last set of settings I want to talk about with respect to the device, and this is actually starting to move a little bit away from the device and more about the profile itself, is the ability to configure where those images you take are going to be stored. So by default, images that are taken are stored on our public cloud space. You have access to them through the URL, as well as inside of the web portal, you'll see hyperlinks to them that point to each of those images. In the event that you need to use the images for other purposes within your organization, or you just want to have them in a different type of storage, you are able to link a Dropbox or a Box account to your profile. Now, if you link a Dropbox account to your profile, it is contained only within that one profile. However, if you were to link a Box account, then it actually spans across all profiles within the company, which can be really helpful if you have your company split up by project or by department, but you want universal access to all the media files. The last note here about media configurations is that there is also the ability to store the images on our space securely. And when I say securely, what I mean is that you will not be able to access them via a public URL, so that will be disabled. You will be forced to access them via the API, meaning you've been an authenticated user and you can't just go ahead and put in the URL to a web browser or any other application to view the image that way. Barrett, did any questions come up while I talked about the management of devices?
Yes, there was one. There was a quick question about the Dropbox and how that was configured and how it can be shared among the account users.
Sure. So if I go into my test environment here, under the company information, if I scroll down here, under the media configuration, you'll see here how it says cloud files. Now, if I want to edit this configuration, what I can do is I can link my Dropbox account this way, or I can also switch to a private container or link the Box account, and then this would enable you to share across all profiles. For each one of these different settings, there is literature on the Customer Success Center that give you detailed steps as well as screenshots on how to set them up. And so I would definitely recommend heading over there if you're interested in setting these up. And if you run into any trouble, then you can let us know. Were there any other questions, Barrett?
So we do have some folks with their hands up, and I'm not sure if that was an accident or if they actually want to have audio rights. So if you would like audio rights, feel free to put your hand back up. Otherwise, just continue to put the questions in the chat, and I'll continue to answer them and field them over.
Sounds good. All right, so let's move on to managing data. So now what we're going to be talking about is how to properly export your data, as well as utilize the built-in reporting functions that are native to your data collection. So the first thing I want to talk about is that there are two primary ways or methods to export your data, and that are going to be your data views versus your data feeds. Now, the way I like to describe these is that your data views are going to be more human readable. It's going to be a little bit easier to digest the data as a reader, whereas a data feed is going to be more machine readable, meaning it's normally going to be easier to integrate it with other systems or to do any sort of analytics with it. So let me go ahead and go over to the data tab and show you where these two are. So you'll see here under the data tab, you'll see this word views with a colon, and it can be kind of hard to see at first, but all of these different options are your data views. Over here it says feeds, and all of these options are your data feeds, and they're separated by a really slight vertical bar so that you can see where they're partitioned. Now, If I go ahead and export my data as a data view, generally speaking, that means I'm going to be able to see the element and option list labels. And so if you are familiar with form building, you'll know that the label is the text that the data collector sees. So it's what's shown on the device. On the other hand, if you are exporting your records as a data feed, you're going to get the data column name for elements and the key values for option lists. And so these are going to be the table headers in the database that are stored. These are not the values that the end user sees. Now, what I've done to demonstrate this is I've actually taken a form that I used in a previous webinar. I exported it as an Excel file, both as a data view using the Excel button, as well as a data feed using the XLS button. And let me go ahead and make sure I'm over here. Good. So on the left, I have my data view. On the right, I have my data feed. And you'll notice immediately that they look a little different. I'm going to talk about the data feed first because some of these columns you'll notice are not in the data view. You'll have columns such as parent record ID, parent page ID, and these scroll across a little bit. And all of these fields refer to the record's metadata. Now, if you're not familiar with what metadata is, I can give you a brief overview. Metadata can be thought of as being data about the data. It's the easiest way to explain it. In this case, with respect to a record, metadata is going to be information about the record itself. Now, what is captured, and this is all done automatically whenever you create a record on iFormBuilder, is you'll have information about where the record was created, as well as when it was modified. And then each record also has a unique ID. And if it was a subform, then you would get the ID and the information of the parent form itself also. Now, in a data feed, you see the metadata. However, in a data view, you do not. So that's one of the first differentiators. If you need access to the metadata, then you are going to have to use the data feed options. Now, aside from the metadata itself, if you look at the first row here, you'll notice that the column names, such as first name, last name, email address, are capitalized with a space. This was how I had the label set up in the form. Over here in my data feed, the column headings are all lowercase, you'll notice, and instead of a space, there is an underscore, and that is because that's how the data column name is set up. You'll notice differences here, for example, where this column says, I'd like to leave feedback for the following Zerion Web Services, versus this column header that just says ZWS underscore feedback. So at that point, you'll see there's a clear distinction between the label text and the data column name. Now, going back to what I was saying before about data views being more human readable, it's a lot easier to understand what each one of these columns represents when I see the label text. It's almost as if I'm seeing the form itself on the device through the lens of a spreadsheet. Conversely, on the other hand, if I look at the data feed, these headings are going to more easily integrate if I'm importing this into another system, for example, but the heading doesn't necessarily give me a good hint as to what the data actually is going to be about. So if you're using a data feed, again, it makes more sense to use this when you're integrating. If you just wanted to take a quick look at the data to understand what has been collected, the data view may make more sense as well. Now, I do have a third Excel file open here, and this is also going to be a data view. The difference is, though, I used the Excel flat export feature for this second one. So over here is the normal Excel file, and this is an Excel flat file. And I wanted to explain the difference because I know this comes up a lot. If I go to this second tab, ZWS feedback, this was a subform in my data collection. And you'll notice here on this first one on the left that was not flattened, I have 17 subform records. On the right, I only have 11. And the reason is, you'll see this ID S27 shows up 4 times here. That's because I filled out that subform 4 times to the one parent form. So these 4 records belong to a single parent. On the flattened version, you'll see this S27 shows up once over here, and as I scroll to the right, it shows up again and again and again. And that's because that record has been flattened now. Barrett, have any questions come up at this point?
Hi, John. Not so much with the data. I think people are really understanding that. There was a question earlier about when you're going through the different settings in iForm, the difference between Android and iOS and where those settings are, but I did respond to that. If anyone else had that same question, feel free to put it in the question box, and I'll send along that response as well as the help desk article that covers that information. Additionally, I do see someone with their hand up, and I'm not sure, again, if that's an accident or if that's on purpose. So if you are the individual that would like to be given audio rights, please let us know by putting some text in the question box or in the chat box within the GoToWebinar control panel. I don't want to give someone audio rights when they're not expecting it. All right, John, is there anything else? Or, I mean, are you ready?
Yep, I'm good to go. I just wanted to check in. I also saw the hand on the control panel, so I just wanted to see if there were any questions I could have answered.
Sure. All right.
Awesome. So we talked about exporting data. We talked about the difference between data views and data feeds, how data views are more human readable, while data feeds are more machine readable. Also showing how the different export options are going to show you labels versus data column names, and that your data feeds are going to give you access to the record and image metadata. Now the last part here is this basic reporting views, and this is actually going to dovetail very well into the next part of this. But I did want to show that there are other options here other than just exporting the file as a data file. So if I select a form, I'm able to go into the HTML view, and what this is going to do is it's going to give me a list of the different records in a very simple HTML table form. Now you'll notice that each one of these records has a rectangular box around it. For records that have subform data, you'll see that the box extends a little bit longer and my subform is split out as well. And so this can be a really quick view to see what it will look like with an HTML table. Another view that you may want or that you may be familiar with is the list view. Now, if I choose a form, I can click on list. The other thing is, because we use this view so often, if you actually click on the form's ID, this will bring you directly to the list view as well. Now, inside this view, it's going to give you a table type look, and you'll be able to see the records that have been filled in. Oftentimes what we'll see people do from here is they will select a record and edit it. Also, what you're able to do is you're able to upload CSV data to this table if you want to populate it. And we see this happening most commonly when you are creating a smart table search or a lookup table. And after you've created the structure of the table, you can then go in here and upload a CSV file with all of the records that you want to be able to look up from. Finally, if I select a record and I click on View Detail, you'll notice over here this gives me a similar view to the HTML view, but I also have access to this button to export this as a PDF. Now, if I click on this, that's going to bring up this view here as a PDF document. Now, this is a little bit different than the HTML view. You'll notice that there's color here for one, but this is also going to be a really quick way to archive an individual record. Now, I know that I've had people ask me if there's a way to download all records as a PDF, and unfortunately there is not. This is going to be a one-time execution, so you'd have to go to an individual record to download it this way.
So John, there was a quick question that came in, and I think it's really helpful to everybody. Can you go back to the Data tab, please? Okay, so in here, they're asking if you can edit more than one record at the same time. So as John was just showing you, once you're in the list view for a form, you can actually select more than one record in the row and actually make edits through that way. If you were to now click the button that says Edit Selected, then he can make a change on this page. Additionally, he could have done a filter and set it up so he only sees a filter for the data that's applicable that he wants to change, and he can select all of those and then make the change. And the last one that John just went over here to see is the stored filter. And once you're in the stored filter, that's actually the best way to change a lot of records in one go. You can create a stored filter, and with that, once you filter the data in that way, we have something called Table Edit View, which would allow you to go in and make those changes. We do have articles on stored filters and record filters on our Customer Success Center as well.
Thanks for that additional information, Barrett. All right, so we talked about being able to see the records in an HTML view, as well as being able to create that PDF, and that's going to be this piece on the right here. So I kind of jumped ahead of my slides a little bit, actually. But one of the other things I wanted to present to you all was the ability to have some built-in reporting functions within iFormBuilder specifically. So natively, you're able to create those HTML data views as well as a PDF data view. The other half of this automated document generation is the ability to send an email automatically within iFormBuilder. Now, there's two ways to do this. The first way is the email element. And so what I have open here already is a form that I had made. Again, this was from a previous webinar. One of the elements I added was an email element. And so this is going to be an element where the user types in their email address or an email address. And one of the properties available to you is that you can enable having it send an email. And so if this is enabled, whatever address is listed in that element's input is going to have a copy of the record sent to them. And so that's why I wanted to show you that HTML view to begin with, because it's going to look very similar to that table when that user receives their record. So this is one way to send an email automatically. The other way, I go under my form assignment, is to set up an email alert. So from here, you can set up an email alert as well. So anytime a new record is submitted, you can set this up where it will email to a specific email address so that you can be kept up to date of the activity that's going on inside of this form. And so that's going to give you two different ways that you're able to send emails automatically. You're also able to automatically create some basic documents that can be generated to be saved or to be distributed. And those are all going to be natively accessible in iFormBuilder. Barrett, can I move on to managing forms and users, or did anyone have a question about the data management?
So there was one quick question about the email options, and they're wondering if they can choose both email options.
Yeah, you can, and given the type of data collection, it might make sense to have both of them. Doing the email alert, I always see it as being it's always going to go to the same email address, and so that is more of a static setting. If you want the email address to go to a dynamic setting, that's normally where you'll use the email element, because you're able to modify the value of it on a per record basis. All right, any other questions, Barrett?
So there's a question about the limit of lines that can be exported to Excel, and I'll just answer this quickly for you to give you a little bit of a breather, John. For this, we don't necessarily have an end criteria for how many lines can be exported, and that's because we allow your form to be completely customized, so you could have one to multiple subforms, and each subform could have multiple records in it. And so that's where it becomes a little bit heavy of a file to export, but it also becomes hard for us to identify exactly the amount of lines that can be exported in one go. What we have is a 500 error. When that pops up when you're trying to export to Excel, then that means that the file size is too large. And that's where we'd recommend that you use either, that you would use that record filter that we showed you moments ago, and only export records for a certain date range until you've downloaded everything. It's also best practice to try to export your data a couple times a month, or depending on how much data is coming in, export it as much as possible so it doesn't get as heavy, and you only are exporting certain time frames. Additionally, what John will go through later on is to take away the human element altogether and automate the process, but I'll sit back and wait till he gets to that point.
You took the words right out of my mouth, Barrett. I was going to be sure to interject and say that there's always going to be a solution so that you don't have to go through that manual process of like a monthly or a weekly export, and that there's a way to make sure that it happens automatically. And so we'll hold off on that. That's actually going to be the fourth thing I talk about. But before that, let's talk about managing forms and users. The primary focus here is that I want to make sure that I communicate to you all a way to set up a scalable solution to collection assignment. So what I mean by that is, because I know everyone has worked on creating forms here, everyone is a current user, you've all gone through the process of assigning a user to a form. Now, when you're in the early stages of a project and you only have a couple of users, maybe a handful of forms, that's not a very difficult task to assign a single user to a single form. But what happens is, as you start to create more forms, as you start to get more users, the task of administrating that can continue to grow as well. And we actually don't want that to happen. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about form groups and user groups as a solution to make sure that the process of doing assignment remains scalable for you. So to introduce these two concepts, a user group is just going to be a logical grouping of users. On the other hand, a form group is going to be the same thing. It's just going to be a grouping of forms. Now, what you can do is you could, for example, have a user group created and assign a group to a single form. That would, in effect, give every user inside of that group access to collect or to view that one form. On the other side of the table, you could have a form group with a bunch of different forms in it and assign a single user to that form group, thus giving one user access to multiple forms in one assignment. Both of those options are a good intermediary, but ultimately the goal that you really want to work towards is having user groups assigned to form groups. So then what you would have happen is you would have multiple users assigned to multiple forms, all done in one assignment. And so this is going to allow you to create what's called a many-to-many relationship. It's also going to allow you to assign multiple users and forms to one another without having to increase the number of assignments that you do. Now, I want to walk us through the process of making both of these. So under forms, if I want to make a form group, I can do it like so. I can name the group. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was this name for my form group is going to show in line with all of my other forms when I go back to do the assignment. And so you'll notice it was also a highlight on the slides, but I always recommend adding an underscore group to the end of this name just to differentiate them from the other forms. And so I'll choose forms that I want to add to this. I can click on create. And I'll do the same thing for my users. If I go to add, edit, I'm sorry, misclicked. If I go to user group, create a new user group. I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to put an underscore group at the end of this. And now when I go to my form assignment, you'll see I have this one group that I made earlier. If I scroll down, or I can actually even sort this, you'll see the webinar group that I made also. So you can use the search functionality here. If I choose to assign users or user groups to this form, then you'll see inside of the users, that group is also listed as well. And so that's why I add the suffix to the end of this, so that you can easily tell if I'm assigning this form to an individual user or to a user group. So if I want to do this, I can now set up my user group to form group association. And now anytime I wanted to add a user to be able to access all those forms, I would just have to add them to the user group. On the other hand, if I wanted to add a new form to the form group, all the users already connected would have access to that form as well. Another thing I wanted to add about the user groups and the users and setting these up and administrating them is that we've come into the scenario recently and once in a while where we'll see organizations use a generic username for their data collection. So at that point, what effectively happens is the username is associated to a device or to a set of devices. And the issue with that is we've actually been hearing about organizations running into issues of accountability and the inability specifically to identify who filled out what. So another best practice I want to recommend to you all is to make sure you keep the username analogous to an individual person, right? So for example, I have a username and Barrett would have her own username. Instead of us sharing a username or sharing a device, because at that point, if a record was submitted, there's no real way to, through the data, identify which one of us submitted it.
And quickly, just going off of that, John and I, as long as we both had separate usernames to log into, we actually could share devices. And it would just mean that every time that he gives me his device, he would have already logged out of it, and I would just log in with my credentials.
Yep. All right. It looks like I didn't see any questions pop up, Barrett, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the last portion of this webinar, which is managing workflows, specifically looking at the goal of automating processes in order to accelerate your workflow. So the idea here is that we all want to be able to work smarter, faster, stronger. I'm sure that everyone in their current use case has areas where they wish they could be more efficient or they wish they could have something done automatically. And a lot of the times it takes getting to that point in order to really explore the options that you have available to you. Now, I have 4 different ways of automating your workflow identified for us today, and I want to go over each one of them briefly. And I'm going to start at the top and talk about post URLs. And this is going to be one of the easiest ways to begin setting up an automated workflow. Now, if I go back to my browser and I go to my form assignment and I choose a form here, I went into this window earlier to look at the assignment or the email alert, but underneath that you'll see there's a section called post data. Post data is where I can create a new endpoint. And an endpoint is just going to be a web address that I specify. And when I specify that address, anytime a record is submitted or updated, it is going to try to send the data of that record to that endpoint. And so at this area, we've already begun to automate our process. I no longer have to manually say this record goes here. This process happens automatically. Now, what you'll see here in this window is I actually have 2 endpoints created for this form. Both of them are for our data flow automation service, which I will talk about as one of our options. And so this means that anytime a record is submitted on this form, it's actually going to be sent to 2 different places. It'll be sent to this address for my first data flow, and then this one for my second data flow. And I know that the URLs look similar, but if I expand this out a bit, you'll see that they are indeed actually different. Now, post URLs are normally going to work in tandem with one of the next 2, whether it's the data flow automation service or working with the API. Now, I'm going to talk about the API next. And a lot of times people are a little bit confused about what the API is or what it actually does. It can be kind of a daunting concept to wrap your head around. The way I like to try to explain the API is that if you think about all the different things that you do when you're clicking around on the web portal or you're filling out a form on a device, all of those actions or tasks can be replicated using the API. And so then what you're doing is you're writing out a script or a computer program to emulate that same process. Now, what that means is not that you're going to have a computer do the data collection for you, but for example, something like assigning a record or creating a record, those processes can be done automatically if you give it the proper set of criteria. For those of you who may not have worked with the API very much or who are a little bit unfamiliar of its capabilities, the easiest example I have to give is if you imagine a work order management system where you're trying to assign a record to a specific user, instead of going into the web portal, creating that record partially, and then assigning it to a user, if you have some sort of an online form or any sort of other way of filling out that information, you can have that record be created, assigned to the user, so that they get it automatically without needing to do that manual process yourself. Now, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. Accessing and leveraging the API really gives you a wealth of different possibilities for automating your workflow and for setting up these types of dynamic reactions so that your workflow can now become more robust and a little bit more complex, and it'll fit your needs better. Now, if you don't have a really strong programming background, or you may not necessarily need the API, or what we found more recently is the actual iFormBuilder API can't handle some of the functionalities that we want to do, then the Dataflow automation service may be a better fit for you. Now, without getting too far into it, the Dataflow automation service is basically an intermediary between accepting data and redistributing it to another service or another system. The idea being here that you want to accept data from a single or from multiple sources, then you'll need to do some sort of a refinement with that data, whether it is filtering it so you only allow certain records, or if you need to do some sort of a transformation, maybe modify the data in a way or reshape it so that it'll fit your reporting needs better, you're able to do that within a data flow. And then finally, you connect those records to what we call an action. And an action is going to be something like sending an email or connecting to a SQL server or creating a PDF document. But those actions are then going to take the record in its newly shaped form and go ahead and integrate with that other system seamlessly. Now, the best part about Dataflow automation is that after you create that data flow, you're able to have it run automatically. So anytime a new record comes in, it executes immediately. The other thing we've found is that, especially internally as we've been using Dataflow automation, because it is visual and kind of graphical, it's really easy to share ideas with one another. It's really easy for us to take a data flow and explain it to somebody else, rather than taking lines and lines and lines of API code and trying to explain that to somebody instead. Now, the last method of automating your workflow I want to talk about today is a service called Zapier. And Zapier is not something that we actually use or provide, but what I've found is that Zapier is a really great service for learning how integrations work and for setting up basic integrations as well. Now, if I go to their website, you'll see that Zapier describes themselves as being able to connect apps and automate workflows, and very similar to what I was talking about us trying to accomplish. You'll see that they work with a variety of different web apps, and basically Zapier has a paradigm where it sets up an integration in two phases. The first phase is going to be a trigger, and then the second phase is going to be an action. So for example, a basic Zapier integration that I've created before is a trigger can be something like creating a new user in iFormBuilder, and then the resultant action could be assigning them a form. So then what I'll have is after the Zap is created, anytime I make a new user, the Zap will run, it'll execute, and it will assign that user a basic set of forms, for example. And so again, I've taken a step that I normally would have to do manually on the web portal, and I've automated it through Zapier.
And John, I'll just interject here quickly. I've used Zapier as well, and I think it's a great milestone or a way to get started with your integration. In Zapier, they do have iFormBuilder documentation, so you'll be able to see what we offer for triggers as well as what we offer for actions. And it's not just one level down. You can have multiple triggers and multiple actions in one workflow. So it's a great way to get started. Another workflow example that I've done in Zapier is I've actually built a form where I have an admin fill out that form with new user information, and then that new user information then creates a user within their iFormBuilder account. So it's a paid service once you're up to a certain level, but it is a great way to start thinking about how to automate and make your life a little bit easier.
Definitely, yeah. I know that Barrett, you introduced me to Zapier, and I've really enjoyed using it. Actually, I thought it was a really great way, especially for me when I started here, learning how to work with the data integrations and being able to set that up. And most importantly, it helped me conceptualize or visualize areas where I might want to automate part of that workflow.
Now, John, there's a question that just came in, and they're wondering if you have any recommendations for the best workflow process for downloading data and getting it into Access.
Sure. Now, actually, so while we're on Zapier, this might be a good solution. I actually don't know if Zapier integrates with Access. I do know it integrates with Google Sheets because I do that personally for myself. But you can set up an integration where anytime a new record is submitted, meaning a new row is either created or updated, that you can have that send to a spreadsheet and have it add that as a row or update that row. So that's one way to do it. The other way I would actually recommend is to look into the data flow automation, because what's really nice about that is not only will it allow you to connect to another service, but it will allow you to modify the contents as well. We run into a lot of scenarios where you set up your data collection in such a way that iForm works really smoothly, but sometimes the values and the fields are not necessarily aligned super tight to your reporting needs or to your storage needs. And so the data flow automation will give you that middle ground where you can go ahead and tweak some of those values and the formatting and the shaping so that the integration is a little bit more seamless.
And just to reiterate, this is for automating the process of getting data into Excel. I mean, there's always the option to manually export the XML and then manually import it into the Access, but to really make your life a little bit easier and automate it and cut out the middleman and the human error, that's where I would actually suggest going through data flow automation. Last I checked, Zapier did not have that functionality. And so, and if you can't use Google Docs, then I think really data flow is the next best, or is the best solution.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. All right, Barrett, I know that I had one last poll prepared for the audience today. I wanted to get a sense for what ways you all are automating your data collection. This is going to be useful for us moving forward to know where we can target the content for these webinars, as well as just to get a little bit of feedback from you all so that we can get a sense of how you all are using the platform.
So John, it looks like we have about 70% of the individuals on today's call have responded.
Okay.
And surprisingly, it looks like the only two options that people have chosen are either API and Other. And I'm wondering if Other is just that they haven't actually built any automation yet. And so that could be a piece of it too.
Yeah, Barrett, and actually I don't need to speak to you. I can speak directly to everybody. But for those of you who chose Other, If you could put in the chat what you are doing in terms of automating your workflow, that would be awesome. It'd be really great for us to get some feedback on that. And while you all are doing that, let me go ahead and give a final summary of what we talked about today. So again, I came into this webinar with the goal and the intention of sharing some essentials for you all as project managers, as administrators of our web service and your data collection needs. And so I wanted to make sure that you had information with regard to mastering your device settings, understanding how to set the devices up to best fit your needs, also how to export data, the different options you have with regard to data views versus data feeds, and then also the built-in reporting capabilities there are within iFormBuilder. The third thing I wanted to communicate with you all was how you can organize your forms and your users using groups. This is going to allow you to make sure you have a scalable solution as your projects continue to grow. And the last thing I wanted to do was get you all thinking about different ways that you could automate your workflow. If you currently have automations in place, how they stack up compared to the other capabilities we may have. And if you don't have any automations in place, hopefully this will kind of spur that those creative juices and get you thinking about different ways that you can make your workflow more efficient or more accelerated. And this way that'll allow you to free up your own time and to put it towards other projects or just making sure that everything runs a little bit smoother. The last thing I have for us is I do have a slide at the end of this with helpful links. And so these are going to be links to, most of these are Customer Success Center articles. I do have a quick link on data flow automation here, which is actually a YouTube video, in case anyone wanted to get more information about that and a little bit more of an introduction to it. But for those of you who are looking for a next step after the stuff I talked about during this webinar, use these links as a launching point to continue your learning and to continue your investigation into these topics. Now, after this webinar is completed, in the next 48 hours, you will receive an email. That email is going to have access to a recording of the session, PDF, and then in this case, I actually didn't have a form package prepared for you all, but what I can do is I can attach the form package for what I showed you actually using the data so that you can export it and then show similar data. And I'll also go ahead and attach the different data view and data feeds for the Excel exports I did. And I'm actually going to be putting all of that up on Zerion Academy so that you don't have to worry about losing an email or anything like that. It'll always be in a central location for everyone. Also, the next webinar we have is going to be, again, an introduction to Zerion Identity Management, what we call ZIM for short. That's going to be on the 2nd of March at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And Barrett, are there any other final questions before we close up this webinar?
Nope, John, just we got a lot of great responses from everyone for what they do and why they selected other. And it seems like a lot of people are still just manually exporting the data and then either using VBA code or using just Excel to change and manipulate it for the reporting. So hopefully this session was helpful in getting people interested in going to that next step of automation.
Definitely. That sounds good. Well, Barrett, thank you for hosting this webinar, and everyone who attended, thank you all for your time and your attention. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to hearing from you all next webinar.